So it's acknowledged that the highest rate of return in early childhood development comes from investing as early as possible in disadvantaged families especially. Research shows that childhood education from birth to 5 years directly influences economic, health and social outcomes for individuals. Now, to discuss the health of South Africa's education system and the real matric pass rate that we saw announced over the past few days, I'm joined here in the studio by Professor Brahm Fleisch. With me in studio, as I mentioned, he's an early childhood educator expert, including Julie Hay in our Durban studios. And Professor Mary Metcalfe is on the line with us from KZN. A very good evening to you all, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
It's a pleasure. And just a small correction, I'm a education policy person, not necessarily an expert in early childhood
education. Thank you very much for clarifying that. And Ms. Hay and Professor Metcalfe, are you with us?
We are, and looking forward to chatting to you.
Professor Metcalfe, have I got you on the line?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, now I can. Thank you very much to all of you. Professor Fleisch, let me start with you in the studio. What is your view of the current state and health of our education system, especially in line with the question that we are asking relating to early childhood development? We've got this amazing pass rate, but some suggest it may even be farcical.
I think that the pass rate is a reflection of gradual and real improvement of the system. So I think we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss the matric pass rate. I generally don't think it's a particularly good indicator, but if you look at the absolute number of learners, both that pass and that get a bachelor pass, they've been going up, which is an indicator that their matric is showing substantial improvement over time.
So what would be an indicator for you?
So the issue is we are improving, but we're improving off a very low base. So is the question, are we where we should be? The answer is definitely not. The reality is that the system over the last 20 years has stabilized, but we need a substantial movement forward if we're going to address the real challenges of our education system.
Okay, let me come to you, Ms. Hay. What is your indicator? What is the litmus test of the real situation that we're looking at, and whether or not the improvements are worthy of being called improvements, especially regarding the low base that the professor is speaking about here?
Well, thank you for allowing me to be here and to share some of my ideas. It's really hard to say what our litmus test would be, but I think probably it would be the number of people who are employable after receiving a matric pass or a matric bachelor's. How many of them are getting into further education, and how many of them are able to be employed? And I think that would probably be what we're looking at, more than just a percentage or a number.
Okay. Professor Metcalfe, what are the learning deficits inherited from our earlier education system? Because that's what some people say we really need to start talking about if we're looking about early childhood development programs and whether or not they have a measure of success.
If we're looking at the legacy of apartheid and how that affects the current education performance, I think firstly that we have still not been able to redress the significant backlogs in terms of resources, infrastructure, and the provinces which do less well are also provinces which carry the burden of the backlog of the apartheid, for example, infrastructural. But there's also qualitative dimensions of the apartheid backlog and the apartheid consequence, and that is mostly seen in a form of teaching which values recitation and repetition and chanting over meaningful engagement with content. Now, where we see this to the present day is an emphasis in the foundation years on, instead of reading for meaning, meaningless recitation of what's in the book. The work that Professor Fleisch is doing and others is changing the way that teachers teach reading so that more learners have access to material that they have. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You can go ahead, Professor.
Sorry. So they've got access to material children are being able to read independently. Children are able to be taught by teachers who've got new ways of teaching reading. So the backlog of apartheid is not only material, infrastructural, it's also in some of the poor teaching methods which impact on the quality of education.
Now, Professor Fleisch, a lot has been said about the quality of the teachers and the training that they're receiving, and Equal Education saying that, we note some of the policy proposals that are being made with regards to early childhood development, but they don't think that they will be effective now, as in they won't make a dent on the system now. What are your thoughts of that, and which should we be starting to look at, especially from international best practice?
So I think that we need to get to the core of the challenge in the education system, which is that the majority of children by the end of grade 3 are not learning to read fluently in either their home language or in English. And that essentially creates a problem that ripples through the entire education system. And when you talk about teachers, the problem is not necessarily teachers, but it's teaching. I think that's important to recognize that the individual teachers are not necessarily the challenge. You've got a whole set of institutional constraints around teachers that make it very difficult for them to shift to a new practice, a new instructional practice that's more effective. And the really important thing that we need to recognize, not just international best practice, but in South Africa as well, and in fact led by the Department of Basic Education, there is incredibly robust evidence about how we can begin to shift the practices that teachers use in their classrooms to get a much larger proportion of learners to become fluent readers by the end of foundation phase. And that, in fact, is going to become the bedrock of improving our education system.
I mean, we were speaking to the African Consciousness Center earlier on at CEO. One of the things that she was pointing to, Professor Fleisch, was that there's a huge disconnect between learners and teachers, and that's also because of the environment. There's no attempt by the system to improve that, including teaching children how to activate their feelings and in being able to express what is working and not working within the system. What are your thoughts of that?
No, I think that obviously there's a strong emotional, affective part of the teaching and learning process. If we ignore that, we do it at our peril. But I do think that there is something very fundamental that needs to be focused on, which is to make sure that all children become successful readers in those first 3 years. By the time they get to grade 4, we talk about in the school system is the first 3 years when children learn to read. From grade 4 onwards, they're going to use reading to learn. And if they haven't acquired very fundamental skills, they're going to struggle as they move up the education system, and not just in the school system, but into the tertiary education system.
Ms. Hay, I'll come to you. I mean, the issue of language, there's been much made of that. Professor Metcalfe spoke about resources earlier on. And all of these matter because if you have such huge inequalities across the board in our schools, you're not going to make that impact nationally that you hope to make, especially when we see the throughput in our matric results.
Tipit, are you asking me that?
I was asking Ms. Hay, but you can go ahead and respond.
Yes, go ahead.
All right, Ms. Hay, let's come to you then.
So, yes, well, I agree with you that resources are very, very important, but I don't think that they are the fundamental key to the success of a matriculant. I think that a lot of emphasis has been placed on material resources, and I think that our greatest resources are our teachers. I agree with what Prof Fleisch is saying about the teaching. We need to help our teachers to become more relaxed in their new type of teaching methods, and I think that what is really key in that perspective is mentoring, having people who know what they're doing and are able to show teachers that different ways are not necessarily terrifying or not going to disrupt their whole status quo, but that it's going to make a significant difference to the children. And we, with what we're doing at Singakwenza, is we're using resources that are made from recycling. So our mentorship of the practitioners in those early years is what we focus on, because we believe that the key is in the people, not in the expensive toys or resources that are being put into schools or creches. So if we can change the teachers to help them understand that they are key to children's success, and that the better educated they become, the more courses they go on, the more they learn and the more they implement with their children, the better our matric pass rate is going to be.
Professor Metcalfe, let me come to you and say, is the model that we have in place sufficient to meet the challenges that we're faced with? As in, is there at least an understanding that we need to match the current challenges with the current environment?
So the response to the current challenges are both material as well as professional. The material is not necessarily about fancy equipment, but making sure that all teachers have the basics. The SACMEC study showed that in KwaZulu-Natal, only 50% of grade 6 learners had a textbook. Until all of our learners have textbooks and teachers are working in classrooms where they have the fundamental elements that are needed for effective teaching, we're not going to see the reduction in the inequalities. But where I agree with the last speaker is that the question of professional support to teachers is the area in which I believe we can make one of the greatest impacts on quality. Very few teachers are working in environments where they can, at a professional level, genuinely debate the challenges that they're experiencing in school, either within the school or with the people who are meant to support them. It's my view that the provinces that do well are the provinces that have a lower ratio in terms of support to teachers, and provinces that are struggling, teachers are very much on their own. So we need to firstly make sure that all of the teachers have the material conditions that are necessary for effective teaching and learning, and then we've got to mobilize the resources that we have so that more teachers are able to have professional conversations about improving teaching and learning.
Now, Professor Fleisch, I want to talk to you about community involvement and training, because we've seen some scare tactics, at least, that have been used in discouraging some of the approaches by some of the provinces, saying that it lacks the involvement of mothers, of women in general in society. And I'd like to hear from you, what is lacking in terms of the human resources or human development approach?
So I think there's a lot of discussion about getting parents more actively involved in their children's education. I think it's really important, but it's very difficult to do. So one of the things, in a study that I did with the Department of Basic Education, one of the intervention arms was a parent support arm. We all recognize parents are incredibly important, particularly in the early years. But the problem is that parents often feel very intimidated, feel very uncomfortable working in partnership with schools. So what we often see is the parents who are most active are the ones that are most likely to be engaging in an ongoing way with the schools, and those who probably need it the most are the parents that feel least empowered to engage with the schools.
Is there a correlation with their education levels, the reticence to be involved?
In the case of the study in the Northwest, these were all quintile 1 through 3 schools. These were rural schools. So there was significant variability, and even though the level of education of the majority of parents was more or less the same, there was slightly higher levels of education meant that those parents would be more likely and more comfortable working in the schools. But I think that we recognize that it's not a straightforward issue. We all recognize that parents are a really important partner in the education process. How to actually get that process working at scale is quite challenging.
Ms. Hale, what has been your experience, especially in educational development which involves communities?
So we've had some incredible experiences, and we've come across some amazing women who are working in the ECD space, many of whom start as a day mother, just taking care of children, but who have a real passion for children. And we've been running our program for 10 years now, and in that time I've seen the most incredible women achieving wonderful things with very little resources. And our program is focusing on that mentorship side that Prof Metcalfe was talking about. It's about helping those ladies to build in confidence. As they grow in confidence, they are reaching out to their parents. The parents are becoming more enabled. And I think we've got a lot of potential in this country. I think it's not a simple solution. I don't think there's any one size fits all education system that we could just put across the board. But I think that there's a lot of work being done, and if we focus on those practitioners and the parents, as Prof Fleisch was saying, I think we've got a really good model going forwards. But we can't just do it with building a classroom and then moving out. It's got to be an investment in the people.
So, talking about investment in the people, Professor Metcalfe, there have been funding gaps that have been noted as preventing, at least reaping the rewards of ECD programs. Do you think that is because generally we see it as the purview of government? Should we be looking at alternative sources of funding, and even outside of the state, sector?
The primary responsibility of the state is to make sure that education as a public good is available on an equitable basis for all learners. Where the private sector can come and supplement that, and where parents can make a contribution to supplement what the state can provide, we need to welcome that. But the fundamental elements of education need to be seen as something that we all contribute to through our taxes, so that all children have an opportunity to learn, and that in fact we are working particularly hard to compensate for the conditions of poverty for the most disadvantaged children. That's the role of education, and that's why we need to prioritize that all children are reached, so that we can change some of the intergenerational cycle of poverty.
Professor Fleisch, I'd imagine that obviously the intent is to better capacitate ECD programs and the service providers thereof. What are the trends that we're seeing that we could improve on? What should we be re-looking at?
So again, my area is particularly the foundation phase, not necessarily programs that address children at a younger age. And I'm convinced that there's now sufficient evidence, compelling evidence from randomized controlled trials and other very rigorous studies, that we could, using a variety of intervention strategies, providing the right kinds of books, focusing on the home language first, looking at the important role that coaching or mentoring plays for teachers, the centrality of assessment, understanding what's going on in the classroom by measuring how learners are progressing. These are all part and parcel of strategies that we could use to improve early grade reading.
You emphasize the foundation phase, and I know a lot of experts have continually searched to the Basic Education Minister, focus on grade 2. So what have you gleaned from that, especially in terms of the trends? As you say, there is enough evidence that exists that there are improvements.
So again, we know that providing good quality lesson plans that provide teachers with a rigorous scope and sequencing of lessons through the duration of the foundation phase. Really good quality books. So children need to have graded readers that are at the right level, that challenge them but are not too difficult, so that it moves them forward progressively. And they need teachers who are supported in the right kind of way. We've known that over the last 20 years, sending teachers to large workshops is not an effective way to help them change their practice. Often they work best when they're working one-on-one with a professional coach or mentor or a head of department who they really trust, and work with them over time to begin to shift their practice.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time and insights, and I do apologize that we didn't have enough time